The discovery. The Tuesday evening meeting of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association began like any other. Residents filed into the community center, clutching folders of complaints and copies of the HOA bylaws. Margaret Chen, a software engineer who'd lived in the neighborhood for 3 years, arrived early to discuss the ridiculous fine she'd received for her mailbox being non-compliant beige instead of association-approved tan. At the head of the table sat Patricia Whitmore, the HOA president, whom everyone privately called HOA Karen. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair hadn't moved in the 2 years since she'd assumed power, and her signature pearl necklace caught the fluorescent lights as she shuffled through her papers with military precision. "This meeting will come to order," Patricia announced, banging her gavel with unnecessary force. "First order of business, the Chen mailbox violation." Margaret stood, ready to present her case with paint swatches proving the colors were identical. But before she could speak, Tom Rodriguez, a retired police detective who lived on Maple Street, raised his hand urgently. "Patricia, I need to address something before we proceed," Tom said, his voice grave. He stood and walked to the corner of the room, where a small wooden podium stood. The residents watched in confusion as he bent down and examined the base. After a moment, he straightened up, holding something small between his fingers. "This is a wireless microphone," Tom announced, his professional training evident in his careful handling of the device. "A sophisticated one. It's been transmitting everything said in this room." The room erupted in gasps and confused chatter. Patricia's face went pale, then flushed crimson. "That's ridiculous. Who would do such a thing?" Tom's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly what I intend to find out. Everyone, please don't touch anything else in this room. This is now a potential crime scene." Over the next hour, Tom conducted an impromptu investigation with the help of several residents. They found 3 more microphones, one hidden inside the ceiling smoke detector, another behind the framed copy of the HOA charter on the wall, and a 4th inside the fake plant near the secretary's desk. "These are professional-grade surveillance devices," Tom explained to the gathered residents. "Not something you buy at a local electronics store. These are expensive and sophisticated. Someone went to great lengths to monitor these meetings." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She thought about all the private conversations she'd had with neighbors in this room before meetings started, discussing their frustrations with Patricia's tyrannical rules and excessive fines. How long had someone been listening? Patricia seemed to recover her composure, her voice sharp. "This is clearly the work of someone trying to undermine my leadership. I motion that we—" "Patricia," Tom interrupted, his detective instincts in full swing. "I noticed something. When I announced finding the first microphone, you didn't seem surprised. You seemed scared, and you immediately asked who would do such a thing, not what it was doing here, or how long it had been there." Patricia's hand flew to her pearl necklace, a nervous gesture Margaret had seen countless times when Patricia was caught in a lie about HOA finances or rule enforcement. "I don't appreciate your implications, Tom. I'm as shocked as anyone." But Tom was already on his phone, calling his former colleagues at the police department. As he stepped outside to make the call, the residents began talking among themselves, theorizing about who could be responsible and why. Margaret noticed Patricia gathering her papers quickly, her hands trembling. "I think we should adjourn this meeting until we get to the bottom of this," Patricia announced, not waiting for a second to her motion. She hurried toward the door. "Patricia, wait," called Sarah Kim, the HOA treasurer. "We need to discuss this. If someone's been spying on our financial discussions, we'll address it at the next meeting," Patricia snapped, already halfway out the door. Tom returned just as Patricia's Mercedes peeled out of the parking lot. "Police are on their way," he announced. "They're treating this seriously. Federal wiretapping laws are involved here. This could be a felony." The residents waited for the police to arrive, but the question on everyone's mind was the same. Who had planted these microphones, and more importantly, why? As Margaret looked around at her neighbors' concerned faces, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. The HOA meetings had always been contentious, but someone had apparently thought they were important enough to risk serious federal crimes to monitor them. What secrets could a suburban homeowners association possibly hold that would warrant such extreme surveillance? The investigation begins. By the next morning, news of the surveillance discovery had spread through Meadowbrook Hills like wildfire. Margaret's phone buzzed incessantly with texts from neighbors, each message more dramatic than the last. The local police had cordoned off the community center and called in the FBI. Given the federal implications of the electronic surveillance, Special Agent Lisa Torrance arrived at noon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who seemed far too serious for what most residents assumed was a neighborhood squabble gone wrong. She set up a temporary command center in the community center's kitchen and began calling residents in for interviews one by one. Margaret was among the first. "Ms. Chen," Agent Torrance began, notepad ready, "how long have you been attending these HOA meetings?" "About 3 years since I moved in," Margaret replied. "But I only started attending regularly about 8 months ago when Patricia, Mrs. Whitmore, started issuing increasingly bizarre fines." "Bizarre how?" Margaret pulled out her phone, showing photos she'd documented. She fined the Johnsons for having a garden gnome that was too whimsical. She cited the Martinez family because their Christmas lights were aggressively festive. She threatened to sue Mr. Patterson because his therapy dog was unnecessarily happy in common areas. Agent Torrance's eyebrow rose slightly. "That does seem excessive. It gets weirder," Margaret continued. "About 6 months ago, Patricia proposed a special assessment, basically a large fee every homeowner would have to pay. She said it was for community improvements, but wouldn't specify what improvements. Sarah Kim, the treasurer, started asking questions about where previous HOA funds had gone. Patricia shut her down fast. This clearly interested the agent. "Did Ms. Kim discover anything?" "Not that I know of." But after that meeting, Patricia changed the locks on the HOA office and said only she would have access to the financial records for security purposes. Sarah had to threaten legal action just to see the quarterly statements. Agent Torrance made several notes. Over the next few days, a picture began to emerge from the various interviews. Patricia Whitmore had become increasingly controlling and secretive over the past year. She'd pushed through rule changes that gave her unprecedented unilateral power. She'd issued over $200,000 in fines to residents in just 18 months. An astronomical amount for a neighborhood of 150 homes, and most suspiciously, she'd fought every attempt to audit the HOA's finances. Tom Rodriguez, with his law enforcement background, had been keeping his own unofficial investigation. On Thursday, he requested a meeting with Agent Torrance and brought a folder thick with documents. "I started digging after the microphones were found," Tom explained. "I pulled the HOA's articles of incorporation, tax filings, and compared them with the financial statements Patricia provided to residents. There are significant discrepancies." Agent Torrance reviewed the documents carefully. "These show that the HOA has paid over $150,000 to a company called Meadowbrook Security Solutions in the past year. What services did they provide?" Tom shook his head. "That's just it. No one knows. There's no visible security service in our neighborhood. No guards, no cameras, nothing." I looked up the company. "It's registered to a commercial address in the next county, but when I drove there, it's just a mailbox at a UPS store." "And you think Patricia created this company?" "I think it's worth investigating. I also found something else." Tom pulled out a bank statement. "This is Patricia's personal checking account. A friend who works at the bank noticed suspicious deposits and tipped me off confidentially. Patricia's been depositing large checks every month, amounts that match almost exactly what the HOA paid to Meadowbrook Security Solutions." Agent Torrance's expression grew serious. Mr. Rodriguez, how did you obtain this bank statement? Tom held up his hands. I didn't obtain it illegally. My friend was concerned and mentioned it. He didn't show me anything, but he suggested I might want to bring this to law enforcement's attention. The actual statement came from Patricia's trash. She threw out bank documents without shredding them. Technically legal to retrieve from the curb. The agent nodded slowly. This suggests embezzlement, but it doesn't explain the surveillance devices, doesn't it? Tom leaned forward. Think about it. Sarah Kim started asking questions about finances 6 months ago. The microphones Tom found were high-grade, expensive. When were they installed? I'd bet around 6 months ago. Patricia needed to know what people were planning, what questions they were asking, who might be organizing against her. Agent Torrance closed the folder. We're executing a search warrant on Mrs. Whitmore's home and office tomorrow morning. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm going to need you to keep this information confidential for now. But secrets in Meadowbrook Hills were hard to keep. By Friday evening, everyone knew the FBI would be at Patricia's house in the morning. Margaret joined several neighbors who gathered at Tom's house that night, watching the news coverage. The local station had picked up the story. HOA president, under federal investigation for embezzlement and surveillance. I can't believe it, Sarah Kim said, shaking her head. I mean, I knew something was wrong, but to actually spy on us? To steal from us? Margaret thought back to all the petty fines, the arbitrary rules, the constant intimidation. It had all been a distraction, she realized. Patricia had kept everyone focused on mailbox colors and garden gnome heights, while she systematically looted the HOA's accounts. As Saturday morning arrived, multiple FBI vehicles rolled up to Patricia Whitmore's large colonial house on the corner of Oak and Maple. Neighbors watched from their windows and yards as agents in windbreakers carried boxes of documents and computer equipment from the house. Patricia herself was led out in handcuffs, her perfect hair finely disheveled, her signature pearls absent. As she was placed in the back of an FBI vehicle, she looked around at her neighbors, watching her downfall. Her expression was neither remorseful nor defiant, just calculating, as if she was already planning her next move. The unraveling, the weekend. After Patricia's arrest, Meadowbrook Hills resembled a media circus. News vans lined the streets, reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and helicopters occasionally circled overhead. Margaret found herself becoming an unofficial spokesperson for frustrated residents, giving interviews about the tyrannical rule of HOA Karen. But the real bombshell dropped Monday morning when Agent Torrance called an emergency meeting at the community center, now swept clean of surveillance devices. Every homeowner who could attend crammed into the space, with others joining via video call. Thank you all for coming, Agent Torrance began, her expression grave. I need to inform you that this case has expanded significantly beyond what we initially suspected. Mrs. Whitmore's activities were more extensive and involved more people than we first believed. She clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on the wall screen. Over the weekend, our forensic accountants analyzed the HOA's financial records, Patricia Whitmore's personal accounts, and the data retrieved from her computers. What we discovered is a systematic embezzlement scheme that has been operating for approximately 3 years, almost exactly when Mrs. Whitmore became HOA president. The first slide showed a complex web of shell companies. Meadowbrook Security Solutions was just the beginning. We've identified 7 different fraudulent companies that Patricia created. She paid these companies for services never rendered, landscaping that was never done, repairs that were never made, legal consultations that never occurred. The total amount embezzled exceeds $600,000. Gasps echoed through the room. Sarah Kim looked physically ill. 600,000? Our entire reserve fund. Everything we'd saved for real emergencies. Gone, Agent Torrance confirmed. But here's where it gets more interesting and more serious. Patricia didn't spend this money on personal luxuries. She wasn't buying cars or jewelry or taking expensive vacations. She was investing it. The next slide showed financial transactions. She used the embezzled funds to purchase cryptocurrency, specifically a mix of Bitcoin and Ethereum. And she was quite successful at it. Her initial $600,000 investment grew to approximately $2.3 million over 3 years. Margaret's neighbor, David Walsh, a financial analyst, whistled low. That's why she was so desperate to keep people from discovering it. She wasn't just embezzling, she was running an investment scheme with stolen funds. Precisely, Agent Torrance agreed. But here's where the surveillance comes in. About 6 months ago, as Mr. Rodriguez discovered, Treasurer Sarah Kim began asking questions. Patricia knew that if an audit was conducted, her scheme would collapse. So she hired a private security firm, a legitimate one this time, to install the surveillance equipment. Tom Rodriguez stood up. Which firm? A company called Secure Watch. Investigations, run by a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, who was fired for misconduct. We're bringing him in for questioning, but he's already lawyering up. Patricia paid him $50,000 to install the microphones and monitor all HOA meetings. He provided her with recordings and transcripts of every meeting for the past 6 months. Another slide appeared, showing email transcripts. Patricia used this information strategically. When she learned that certain residents were planning to call for a vote of no confidence, she preemptively created violations for their properties, fining them and threatening them to keep them off balance. When she discovered that Tom Rodriguez was investigating the shell companies, she filed complaints about his property to the county, trying to get him cited for code violations that didn't exist. Margaret felt her anger rising. She remembered the stress, the anxiety, the feeling that Patricia was always one step ahead. Now she knew why, but Patricia made a critical mistake, Agent Torrance continued. She became paranoid. She didn't just monitor HOA meetings. She expanded the surveillance to her own home. She was worried that her husband might discover what she was doing, so she placed monitoring devices throughout her house without his knowledge. A man in the back row stood up, Richard Whitmore, Patricia's husband. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. "I had no idea," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear to you all, I had no idea what she was doing. When the FBI searched our house, they found recording devices in our bedroom, our home office, even our kitchen. She was recording everything I said, every phone call I made." Agent Torrance nodded sympathetically. "Mr. Whitmore is not under investigation. He's been cooperative and has provided valuable information. However, this is where the federal charges become very serious. Interstate wire fraud, money laundering, illegal surveillance, conspiracy. Patricia Whitmore is facing potentially decades in federal prison." Sarah Kim raised her hand. "What about our money? Can we get it back?" The cryptocurrency accounts have been frozen and seized. However, converting that back to cash and distributing it to the HOA will take time. There will also be legal fees and complications. In cases like this, victims typically recover 60–70% of stolen funds, but it can take years. The room erupted in angry murmurs. Families had been planning to use HOA reserves for crucial repairs. Some residents on fixed incomes had struggled to pay Patricia's excessive fines. Now they learned those funds had been gambled on cryptocurrency. But Agent Torrance wasn't finished. "There's one more thing you all need to know. Patricia didn't work entirely alone. We've identified an accomplice, someone who helped her create the shell companies and manage the financial transactions." The room went silent. Another resident involved. Her accomplice is her sister, Diane Morrison, who works as an accountant. She lives in Nevada and helped Patricia set up the fraudulent companies, creating false invoices and documentation. We executed a warrant on her home this morning. She's also been arrested. Tom Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief. All this over an HOA. She destroyed lives, broke federal laws, spied on her own husband, all to steal money from her neighbors. Greed is a powerful motivator, Agent Torrance said, but so is the belief that you won't get caught. Patricia Whitmore thought she was smarter than everyone else. She thought her position as HOA president made her untouchable. She was wrong. As the meeting concluded, residents filed out in a daze. Margaret stood on the community center steps, looking out at the neighborhood she'd called home for 3 years. The perfectly manicured lawns, the uniform mailboxes, the carefully enforced rules, all of it had been a facade hiding something rotten at its core. The fallout, the weeks following Patricia's arrest, transformed Meadowbrook Hills in ways no one anticipated. The media attention gradually faded, but the internal turmoil intensified. An emergency election was held to replace Patricia as HOA president, with Tom Rodriguez reluctantly accepting the position after being drafted by unanimous vote. His first act was to suspend all pending fines and violations pending review. His second was to hire a forensic accountant to conduct a complete audit of every transaction during Patricia's tenure. What they discovered was even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Margaret attended the meeting where the accountant, a serious woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, presented her findings. The community center was packed with standing room only. "I've been conducting forensic audits for 15 years, Dr. Vasquez began, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Mrs. Whitmore didn't just embezzle funds. She systematically restructured the HOA's finances to maximize her theft while minimizing the chance of detection." She pulled up a spreadsheet on the projector. 3 years ago, when she became president, your HOA had $890,000 in reserves. Your neighborhood was well-funded and fiscally healthy. But Patricia immediately began making changes. She increased the annual dues by 15%, claiming it was necessary for improvements. She instituted a fine system that generated an average of $11,000 per month, an astronomical amount for a community this size. Sarah Kim, still dealing with guilt over not catching the embezzlement sooner, spoke up. "But we saw the quarterly reports. The account balances looked normal because she falsified them," Dr. Vasquez explained. Patricia had access to the HOA's accounting software. She created false entries showing money in accounts that had been drained. The real bank statements told a different story. She also manipulated the timing of transactions. She would embezzle funds at the beginning of each quarter, invest them in cryptocurrency. Then, if she made a profit, she'd return the original amount to the HOA account before the quarterly review. If she lost money, she'd simply falsify the records. David Walsh, the financial analyst, leaned forward. "That's incredibly sophisticated for someone without financial training." Her sister Diane was the brains behind the financial manipulation, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. "Text messages we've received from the FBI show they communicated daily about the scheme. Diane would advise Patricia on which cryptocurrencies to invest in and how to hide the transactions. But the financial crimes were only part of the story. The surveillance aspect had opened a Pandora's box of legal and personal issues. Multiple residents had filed lawsuits against Patricia for invasion of privacy. The recordings had captured not just HOA business, but personal conversations, gossip, and private discussions that people had before and after meetings. One recording, played in closed session for the board members, was particularly damning. It captured Patricia talking to herself after a meeting, reviewing her notes. "These idiots have no idea," her voice said clearly. "Too busy arguing about fence heights to notice I'm cleaning out their accounts. The best part is they think I'm mean because I'm dedicated. Every fine I issue, every complaint I file, just makes them think I'm a zealous volunteer. They'll never suspect embezzlement." The cold calculation in her voice had chilled everyone who heard it. Meanwhile, Patricia's husband, Richard, had filed for divorce and was cooperating fully with the FBI. In a statement to the neighborhood newsletter, he wrote, "I feel betrayed and horrified by what my wife did. To spy on me in my own home, to steal from our neighbors and friends, to put our family in this position, I'll never understand it. I'm selling the house and moving away. I can't face any of you after what she did." The house went on the market immediately, priced to sell quickly. Within days, Margaret heard that a young family had put in an offer, people new to the area who didn't know the history. She wondered if they should be told, but legally, there was no obligation to disclose that the home's previous owner was facing federal charges. The legal proceedings against Patricia and Diane moved forward rapidly. Both faced over 20 federal charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and violations of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. The U.S. Attorney's Office was not offering plea deals. They wanted to make an example of the case. "This prosecution sends a clear message," the U.S. Attorney announced at a press conference. "No one is above the law, not even a homeowners association president. White-collar crime is still crime, and illegal surveillance violates fundamental privacy rights. But for the residents of Meadowbrook Hills, the biggest challenge wasn't legal, it was rebuilding trust. The revelation that their HOA president had been spying on them created a pervasive sense of paranoia. People were reluctant to speak freely at meetings. Some residents stopped attending altogether. Tom Rodriguez, as the new president, addressed this at a community meeting. "I know we're all dealing with trauma from what happened. We feel violated and betrayed, but we can't let Patricia's crimes destroy our community. We need to heal, and that starts with transparency." He proposed a radical restructuring of the HOA's governance. No more unilateral power for the president. All financial transactions over $500 must be approved by a majority vote of the board. "Our treasurer will have full access to all accounts at all times. We'll publish monthly financial statements online for every resident to review. And we're implementing term limits. No one can serve as president for more than 2 years. The changes passed unanimously. But Margaret noticed something else happening in the neighborhood. People were connecting in ways they hadn't before. The shared experience of being victimized by Patricia had created a strange sense of solidarity. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now organizing dinner parties and block events. The community center, once a place people dreaded visiting for HOA meetings, became a genuine gathering place. One evening, Margaret was working in her yard when her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stopped by with her therapy dog. The one Patricia had once claimed was unnecessarily happy. "I wanted to thank you," Mrs. Patterson said. "For what?" Margaret asked. "For standing up to her. For documenting all those ridiculous fines. Your records helped the FBI build their case. If you hadn't been paying attention, she might have gotten away with it for years longer." Margaret felt a weight lift slightly. Maybe something good could come from this after all. She thought about all the petty rules, the fear of arbitrary fines, the stress of wondering what Patricia would find fault with next. All of that was gone now. "We're going to be okay," Margaret said, more to herself than to Mrs. Patterson. "We're going to build something better than what she destroyed." Justice and Renewal 6. Months after Patricia Whitmore's arrest, the federal trial began. Margaret had been subpoenaed as a witness, along with a dozen other Meadowbrook Hills residents. The courthouse in the city was imposing, all marble columns and serious-faced security guards, a far cry from their suburban community center. Patricia entered the courtroom looking nothing like the perfectly coiffed HOA president who had terrorized them. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore minimal makeup, and her clothes were plain and professional, clearly chosen by her defense attorney to make her appear sympathetic. But when her eyes swept across the gallery, filled with her former neighbors, there was no remorse in them, only calculation. The prosecution's case was devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Morrison, no relation to Patricia's sister, methodically presented evidence of embezzlement, wire fraud, and illegal surveillance. He displayed bank records, cryptocurrency transactions, falsified HOA documents, and recordings from the hidden microphones. The defendant didn't just steal money, Morrison told the jury in his opening statement. She created an entire system of control and surveillance to protect her criminal enterprise. She weaponized her position as HOA president, using her authority to intimidate, silence, and distract anyone who might discover her crimes. Margaret's testimony came on the third day. She explained how Patricia's excessive fines and arbitrary rules had created an atmosphere of fear in the neighborhood. She described documenting every violation notice, every threatening letter, every instance of what seemed like personal vendetta disguised as rule enforcement. "Why did you keep such detailed records?" Morrison asked. "Because something felt wrong," Margaret replied. "The fines were so excessive, so petty. A $500 fine because my mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. It didn't make sense. I'm an engineer. I solve problems by collecting data. So I started documenting everything, thinking maybe I could prove there was a pattern of unfair treatment. And what did your data show? That Patricia fined people more heavily if they questioned her authority. Residents who asked to see financial records received an average of 3 times more violation notices than those who stayed quiet. It was systematic intimidation. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Kendall, tried to paint Patricia as an overzealous volunteer who had made poor financial decisions but hadn't intentionally committed crimes. Mrs. Whitmore was trying to invest the HOA's money to help it grow, Kendall argued. Yes, she should have disclosed this to the board, but her intentions were good. She wanted to increase the reserve fund through smart cryptocurrency investments, but this argument fell apart under cross-examination. Morrison produced emails between Patricia and her sister showing clear knowledge that what they were doing was illegal. In one email, Patricia had written, "As long as no one audits the accounts, we're fine. Just need to keep them distracted with petty complaints until we can cash out." Tom Rodriguez's testimony was particularly damaging. He walked the jury through his investigation, explaining how he discovered the shell companies and traced the money. His background as a police detective lent credibility to his methodical approach. The surveillance wasn't about security, Tom testified. It was about control. Patricia needed to know what people were saying about her, what questions they were asking, who might be organizing to challenge her. She used that information to stay one step ahead, to neutralize threats before they could develop. The surveillance evidence was played for the jury, selected excerpts that demonstrated Patricia's manipulation. In one recording, Patricia could be heard talking with her sister Diane on the phone during a break in an HOA meeting. "Sarah's getting too nosy about the landscaping company payments. I need you to generate invoices with more detail. Make it look legitimate. And that Rodriguez guy, I need dirt on him. Can you run a background check? There's got to be something we can use." Diane's voice responded, "This is getting risky, Patty. Maybe we should cash out and stop." "Not yet," Patricia replied. "We're so close to 3 million. Just a few more months. I've kept these idiots in line this long. I can manage a little longer." The courtroom was silent as the recording played. Several jury members looked disgusted. Patricia's sister Diane had accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Patricia. Her testimony was clinical and damning. She explained exactly how they'd set up the shell companies, how they'd falsified documents, how they'd structured the cryptocurrency investments to maximize returns while minimizing the risk of detection. "Patricia was the one who came up with the plan," Diane testified. "She called me about a year after she became HOA president. She said she'd been reading about cryptocurrency and realized that the HOA's money was just sitting there, not growing. She asked if I could help her borrow it temporarily to invest, and you agreed." Morrison asked. "Yes, I'm an accountant. I know better, but she's my sister. She convinced me it was low risk, that we'd pay it back. But then the investments did well, and she got greedy. It stopped being about helping the HOA and started being about how much we could accumulate. When did you realize you'd crossed into criminal territory? Almost immediately, Diane admitted, tears streaming down her face. But by then we were already in too deep. Every month I'd tell her we should stop, and every month she'd convince me to continue. The surveillance was her idea entirely. When I found out about that, I knew it had gone too far, but I didn't know how to stop it without destroying both our lives. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The defense called character witnesses who described Patricia as a dedicated volunteer who cared about her community. But the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing 2 months later, Judge Maria Alvarez addressed Patricia directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, you held a position of trust in your community. People elected you to protect their interests and manage their collective resources. Instead, you systematically betrayed that trust. You stole from your neighbors, spied on them, intimidated them, and created an atmosphere of fear and control. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single poor decision. This was a calculated, sustained criminal enterprise that lasted years." Patricia was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. She was ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution, the full amount of the cryptocurrency portfolio, which would be liquidated and returned to the HOA. Diane received a lighter sentence of 3 years due to her cooperation, but her accounting license was permanently revoked. As the marshals led Patricia away, she finally showed emotion, not remorse but anger. She turned to glare at the Meadowbrook Hills residents who had attended the sentencing, her face contorted with rage. "You people were always so pathetic," she hissed. "So easily controlled. You deserved what happened to you." The judge banged her gavel. "Remove the defendant from my courtroom." Outside the courthouse, Tom Rodriguez addressed the gathered media. "This has been a difficult chapter for our community, but justice has been served. We've learned painful lessons about accountability and oversight. We've restructured our HOA to ensure this can never happen again. And most importantly, we've come together as neighbors, not just property owners." Margaret stood with her neighbors, feeling a sense of closure. The mailbox that had started her journey, the non-compliant beige that had led to her documenting Patricia's behavior, was still there, unchanged. But everything else was different. The HOA had received most of the stolen money back thanks to the seized cryptocurrency accounts. The reserve fund was being rebuilt. More importantly, the culture had changed. Meetings were now collaborative discussions, not intimidating interrogations. Rules were being reviewed and revised to be reasonable. Fines were rare and proportional. 6 months after the sentencing, Meadowbrook Hills held a neighborhood barbecue. It was the largest gathering in the community's history, with nearly every resident attending. Children played on the common areas, where Patricia had once forbidden excessive running. Garden gnomes of all levels of whimsy decorated yards. Christmas lights would be as festive as people wanted that year. Margaret stood with Tom, Sarah, and several other neighbors who had been at the center of the investigation. They watched the community they had helped rebuild. "Do you think she understands what she destroyed?" Sarah asked. "Not just the money, but the trust, the community?" Tom shook his head. "People like Patricia never do. They see the world transactionally." She looked at the HOA and saw an opportunity for personal gain. She never understood that it was supposed to be about building something together. Margaret raised her beer. "To building something better." The others joined the toast. Around them, neighbors laughed and talked freely, without fear of arbitrary rules or hidden microphones. The trauma of Patricia's reign would take years to fully heal, but healing had begun. The community center's walls had been painted and redecorated. In the main meeting room, where hidden microphones had once recorded every word, there now hung a simple plaque. "A community thrives on trust, transparency, and mutual respect. May we always remember these values." As the sun set over Meadowbrook Hills, casting golden light across the perfectly imperfect lawns and mailboxes of every conceivable shade, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine pride in her community. They had faced betrayal, survived investigation, endured a trial and emerged stronger. The HOA Karen was gone, but the community remained, wiser, more vigilant, and finally, truly neighborly.